Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cattlemen's Day 2020. It's our pleasure to put this program together. We think we've put a very good educational program together today. We think we've got some really good speakers. What we'd like to start off with, though, this morning is I should introduce myself. My name is Ken Odie. I'm a faculty member here in the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry. Our department, I left the department head position in January of 2018, and we had an interim department head for about a year and a half, and then last summer, Dr. Mike Day joined us as our new department head. Dr. Day is originally from Missouri, trained at Nebraska, was on the faculty at Ohio State for approximately 30 years, and then department head at Wyoming for 4 years. Before we were able to recruit him here to Kansas State University. So we're absolutely delighted that Dr. Day is on board with us, and we're going to have him provide a few comments to you here this morning, and so you get to know him a little better. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mike Day.
Thank you, Ken. It's great to be here. I came in August to Kansas State University, as Ken said, from Wyoming. And standing here in front of this group, we had our Livestock and Meat Industry Council meeting yesterday. We had the Stockman's Dinner last night. Patsy Houghton was our award winner, tremendous recipient for that award. And I stand here today and I look out across this crowd, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to become part of K-State. We have this great event. We've got participants here. I think, do we have some down in the arena also? We're simulcast down in the arena. And so the strength and the depth and the breadth of the cattle industry in Kansas is obvious as I look across this crowd and attend other events in Kansas. We've got great students. We've got great faculty. The department is doing well. Dr. Odie told me we need to just get things going. So I don't really have a whole bunch more to tell you except welcome to Weber Hall, to the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry. It's great to have you here. We have a great slate of speakers and outbreak sessions for the day, and then the bull sale after that. So we hope you'll stay with us the entire day. With that, I'm going to introduce another new person, at least in permanent appointment, our Dean of the College of Agriculture, Dr. Ernie Minton. And so, Ernie, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you very much, Mike. It's certainly great to be here. And I bring you greetings on behalf of the college and K-State Research and Extension to Cattlemen's Day this year. Many of you know, perhaps some of you don't, I was a faculty member, I guess technically still am, in the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry since 1983. And, you know, Cattlemen's Day was always a special event through my time as a active faculty member in the department, and that tradition has continued, and I think our programs have evolved to become really very, very strong. I'll just amplify a message that Dr. Day alluded to, and that is the fact that what he said attracted him to K-State is something we take very, very seriously, and that is we really hold true to that land-grant mission. We value all three of those mission areas of teaching, research, and extension outreach missions. And actually, this particular program brings really all of those things together in a really, really nice event. And what this allows us to do is to make sure that we stay in contact with stakeholders. This event really focuses on something that we all know is quite important to the state of Kansas and the region. And so we're very happy to bring you educational programming, some highlights on recent research, and other kinds of things that bring us in contact with you. And a lot of the good things that happen also happen not just in the sessions, but in the hallways between the sessions and between here and the bull sale in the afternoon and so on. Before I conclude my remarks, I too want to congratulate Dr. Patsy Houghton on nice recognition last evening, very well deserved, and certainly very well put on and laid out last evening. I really did enjoy that. So again, welcome to campus, and we hope you have a great day. And Ken, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Ernie. As we were getting ready to put this program together way last fall, and I need to introduce Dr. Dale Blasi. Dale is the co-chair of the Cattlemen's Day program. There's a lot of planning that goes into these events, and we use kind of our history. But one of the things that's, I think, become so obvious to all of us is that this industry that we call the U.S. beef industry is increasingly becoming much more global. And I think there's probably no better example than that than what a coronavirus concern across the globe and the effect it's actually having on cattle markets. And we're seeing that more and more all the time. African swine fever, trade issues and trade agreements, but we're increasingly becoming a very much a global industry affected by global events and activities. So as we were putting this program together, we were thinking about a couple of things. One is this whole global protein supply and how that might affect the beef industry, and we were thinking about African swine fever and the pork industry. But we're also thinking about, while this is going on, the world of technology in agriculture and the world of technology in animal agriculture is simultaneously moving rapidly. So today we're going to start off with our first speaker, Lorna Marshall. Lorna is a Kansas State University graduate, was our animal science distinguished alum just this past year. She has a master's degree in animal breeding and genetics from Colorado State University, and I knew her at Colorado State when I was there. Then has worked in the AI industry for most of her career. And at this time, she's vice president of beef programs at Select Sires. And her topic today, she's going to talk to you about the genetic and reproductive trends in the global beef industry. So please help me welcome Lorna Marshall.
Thank you, Dr. Odie. Can you hear me? Yep. Can you hear me? Awesome. Well, first of all, is that okay? There we go. I want to thank everybody for allowing me the opportunity to be here today. There is nothing I love more than coming back to Manhattan, Kansas, and my alma mater. And while I'm not on staff here, I have to tell you, we get the opportunity at Select Sires to work with a lot of different organizations and land-grant universities across the country. K-State is extremely, extremely unique in terms of the culture that we have within this department. We talk a lot about in business strategy and culture. Can culture trump strategies, strategy trump culture? And I will tell you the really neat thing I think about Kansas State University's Animal Science Department is they have maintained a culture that I grew to love when I was a student here, so that's over 25 years ago. And yet they implement strategies when you look at the research development, the activities that they're involved in the industry that really make them, I think, the number one choice for us, not only to do research with, but to recruit students from our organization. So Dr. Odie, I know you had a lot to do with that, being the department head over the last several years. We look forward to what Dr. Day does going forward, but you know, for those of you from Kansas, I don't know if you realize how valuable this asset is and how unique it is relative to the other land-grant universities across the United States. So with that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time today, but I would like to share with you some of the things that we look at in our business and how that is going to impact cattle producers within the state of Kansas. So one of the things that we talk about a lot is the speed of change is increasing. We see this, I know it's true across the entire industry, but I think we see it more on the genetic side just because of a lot of the technologies that we have been able to access and that we've developed over the last couple of years. And what I would tell you is if you think the change has been dramatic over the last 5 years, I think it's getting ready to change at a much faster pace going forward because of several things that actually are happening to the genetic side of our business from outside pressures that we're having to kind of work around and adopt. So genetics are only going to become more important, but the neat thing is that it's because we can positively impact what I think are two of the big drivers. That is one, management practices that are going to be determined by a lot of things, one of those being labor and the issue of labor that we have across our entire industry. And then the other one is consumer demands. With social media today, we are more transparent than we've ever been in the past, and we're going to have to be. And so we are going to have to be more responsive to consumer demands. And the cool thing is that we can positively impact both consumer demands and management practices, I think, to make our industry more competitive. So what are a couple of the trends that, from a genetic company standpoint, that we spend a lot of time talking about? The first one of those would be humane animal treatment. A lot of you probably saw what the dairy industry was faced with on Facebook this last year in terms of how some calves had been treated, how we manage cow comfort and things like that. It's been in the news a lot. And so humane animal treatment is very important. And we're looking at what are some things we can do from a genetic perspective to really change that. So you may or may not know as beef producers, but about 90% of the Holstein population is horned. And so while we don't deal with a lot of horns on the beef side of our business anymore, it is still something that we deal with every day on the dairy side of our business. And so if we can utilize gene editing for some traits that generally maybe would be seen as a positive consumer experience or more humane animal handling by our consumers, I think that is a way that we can sell these technologies that have a lot of benefits to our industry to the consumers. And so I think you will see gene editing eventually get approved. Whether or not our consumers accept it or not, I think is another question, but I think how we approach them with some of the things that we can do through gene editing is really going to determine whether we can sell that technology to them or not. Other things we're working on, creating disease resistance, or at least creating cattle that can manage disease better. Things like BVD, leukosis, Johne's, heat tolerance, hair shedding, overall wellness and health traits. We've got those on the dairy side. There's a lot of data being collected on the beef side of our business so that we're going to actually be able to select cattle that are healthier than the bottom end of our population. Today we see about anywhere between a 22 and 45% difference in treatment rates between the animals that we've identified in the dairy world as being very healthy from the bottom quartile that would be below average for some of the wellness traits that we have. So we can really change treatment among cattle by selecting for wellness traits. Sustainability, another trait that we can really is very, very important to our consumers. So on the dairy side, we had a trend called the little brown cow. So Holsteins made up a huge portion of what the milking population was in the United States. But where do a lot of the dairy cows live, or did live? On the West Coast, where we have a lot of water and environmental issues by those consumers. So a lot of the dairies in California have gone to smaller cows so that they have a better sustainability story. So we call it the little brown cow story because essentially they moved from a Holstein population to a Jersey population. But we have a lot of Holstein dairy producers that are selecting for a smaller cow so that they have a better carbon footprint and a better sustainability story. That hasn't been as important for us on the beef side today, but there's a lot of things that we can do in terms of feed efficiency to decrease the amount of water intake that we need to produce the same amount of product. Another trend would be carcass quality. That's been very popular over the last 10 to 15 years within the beef industry. We've made huge strides in terms of increasing the quality of our product. With that, we have increased beef demand in a way that I don't think any of us expected that we could in the last 5 to 10 years. The neat thing is that is really a global trend. If you travel internationally at all, people want domestic, U.S. produced, high quality beef. They have now tried it, they like it, and they want more of it. And so the trend towards selection for more in-product merit is not going to go away, but I think will only increase. But I think it's a great success story of what we can do in terms of genetic selection and actually changing the economic drivers in our business by improving beef demand. And the last one I'll mention has more to do not so much with consumers, but with our cow-calf producers. The number one problem that our producers that utilize our technology have is labor. They don't talk about any really genetic trait that you would typically think of, but they want us to help solve their labor issues. We see consolidation in the dairy industry, and I think it's coming in the beef industry where our commercial cow-calf producers are going to get bigger, as are our seed stock producers. And their number one problem is labor. So from a genetic perspective, what are things that we can do to make their labor issues less of a problem? So that means creating calving ease cattle that have convenience traits. If they have to touch one, whether that's to treat them for a health issue or health incidents, or whether that's udders, feet, having to cull them early, anything that causes them to touch that animal outside the normal of that population is going to be considered a labor incidence that we can probably actually improve upon. So what are some of the future technologies going to look like that are going to help us address some of these different issues? One of those is going to be molecular genetics and gene editing. It is a useful tool in other countries. It's not approved here in the United States yet, but I do think that it's coming, and we would have companies within the AI industry that own and control that technology and are utilizing it in other countries today. Embryo technology, we're going to talk about that quite a bit because actually I think in several different markets that is going to replace semen in terms of creating pregnancies. In the past that maybe has not been a technology that's been useful because it's been cost prohibitive, but with the use of IVF technology today and the fact that we've improved a lot of the technologies around not only aspirating those but also creating those IVF embryos, it's become a very cost-effective tool. So for example, we're going to talk about the beef on dairy industry just a little bit. We have a Jersey cow. We want her to create an animal for the beef industry. Why would we utilize her Jersey genetics to create that calf when we can put a straight Angus or a, say, half Angus, half Charolais embryo in her and just utilize her as a recipient to create the product that we actually want? That would have been cost prohibitive 5 or 10 years ago, but with the technology we have available today, those types of discussions are certainly going to be much more doable. Phenotypes for novel traits, I think the biggest advantage or the biggest opportunity or horizon that we have in the beef industry is on the health traits. We've actually seen over the last 5 years what we can do in the dairy industry by selecting for health traits, capturing that data and selecting for it. Huge opportunity for us, not only in terms of the story that we tell our consumer, but also in terms of the economic advantages that it creates for us as an industry. Big data, this is going to be huge. I don't think that we've actually seen it come to fruition quite yet in the beef industry, but on the dairy side of our business, there is getting to be less and less public information available to those of us that make genetic decisions. It's becoming much more prioritized in terms of being owned by private industries and not being shared, and everybody having their own unique genetic evaluation. So the race is really going to be not just who can get the most data, because honestly we're figuring that out with all of the computer technology that we have. It's really going to come down to the people that do the data analytics and can figure out how to mine the data and actually capture the information that can make differences and that we can apply from a production standpoint. So it's not so much how we capture the data, but it's really how we analyze it and utilize it, and who does the best job of figuring that out that's going to win that race. And then computing technologies, artificial insemination or artificial intelligence is actually going to become something that I think we see getting used in a lot of animal agriculture, not just in terms of how we can model genetic evaluations, but also how our producers make decisions and how we can actually utilize that to improve the systems that we have. So collectively, we're going to have better genetic, reproductive, and analytical tools that we can utilize not only from a genetic perspective, but then implementing it in terms of the reproductive technologies that we use. This is a slide that's just a couple of years old, but it shows the use of embryos worldwide. I think one of the things that a lot of people in the US don't realize, this would be South America, and this would be North America, and this would just show the number of embryos that get implanted within these different segments worldwide. South America has been utilizing embryo technology to a much higher degree than we have for the last 5 years. Part of it is because it's actually a cheaper technology in South America. And then secondly, it's driven by the fact that they have a lot more people trained to actually put those embryos in to actually create the pregnancies. Some of this is on the dairy side of the business, but most of this is actually on the beef side of the business in South America. And that's why you see a lot of those IVF companies actually have origins in that part of the world. As you can see, that trend's changed a lot in North America. The big differences between these two is most of this is going into commercial cows. So they're not necessarily utilizing this as a seed stock technology, but they're utilizing this as a commercial technology to actually create pregnancies in the commercial beef industry down there. Whereas here, this has been primarily a seed stock technology because of the cost and just limited number of people that can actually implant those embryos for us. This is changing really dramatically for a couple of reasons. One, the dairy side of our business in terms of genetics is becoming incredibly competitive. For those of you that don't follow Holstein markets like you follow beef bull sales, we're paying upwards of $1 million for a lot of the Holstein sires that are really genetically superior on the dairy side of our business. So some bulls have become very, very valuable depending upon their genetic makeup and what the genomics tells us about them. And so we have to figure out ways that we can turn those generation intervals and create those kind of genetics really, really quickly. And I think we will see more and more IVF use by the seed stock beef industry as well, because as genomics become more and more accurate, we can make better selection decisions earlier in their life, and we can really start to change genetics in a really, really quick manner utilizing that. The other thing is that the embryo technology in the United States has really dropped in terms of cost as the processes have improved. So today we can make commercial IVF embryos out of commercial cows available for around $50. And probably with 2 embryos, you can create a pregnancy. So you can create a pregnancy that you specifically designed for probably around $100. And so the technology has gotten cheaper. And so I think we'll see a lot more applications to how it gets used in both the beef and the dairy side of our industry here in the US. Who's going to be offering genetic evaluations in the future? I think this is going to be really interesting. Traditionally, particularly, it's been breed associations on both the beef and dairy side of our business. I think we're going to see more private entities enter this segment of our business. So today we know that Zoetis and Igenity, who would be the 2 big DNA providers, both have the capabilities to create their own genetic evaluations if they want to. Breeders. One of the really confusing things I think in the beef marketplace today is not only do the breed associations publish a lot of genetic values, so they've got their own indexes, but now we have breeders who also come up with their own indexes, which is great because lots of times they fit their specific customer base and maybe a market system that they're tied to, but it just creates a lot more different numbers floating around out there in the industry that you as commercial producers have to sort through and figure out which ones have value to you, apply to your operations, which ones don't. And then other genetic companies. One of the really interesting things I think happening in the AI space today is my biggest competitor is not necessarily another AI company, but we have all these new folks that are entering the business that are starting to create not only their own genetic evaluations, but figure out other ways to enter our space that are pretty non-traditional. And then finally, is it going to look more like the pork and poultry industry? As we know, that's a very consolidated business. All of the genetics are controlled by private industry, and they are proprietary, so you have to be contractually arranged somehow with these genetic companies in order to access their genetic information. I don't think that we'll be there in the next 5 to 10 years in the beef industry, but I do think that you will see more of those type arrangements start to develop as we build better supply chains. So likely your genetic information is going to be tied to some type of production and marketing system that you are participating in. I think that's one of the really neat things that we've seen happen in the beef industry as we've gotten better at marketing our product, is these would all be different branded beef programs that exist out there in the country today. And I think the interesting thing about that is they're all designed a little differently. They all have different levels of control. They all have different levels of feedback. And I think we're going to see a lot of different types of business models develop, but all with the same goal of creating more branded beef programs to target consumer groups. So what will drive us towards more coordination than we've had in the past so that we have a more coordinated effort to supply genetic information and make better decisions regarding our genetics and reproduction? One of those is going to be consumers will demand it, and the technology for traceability continues to get better. So, when we talked about this 10 years ago, RFID technology wasn't nearly as good as it is today. We didn't have all of the high-density readers that we now have available to be able to track that information. We didn't have feed yards and packing plants that had the ability to capture the information even if we had the tag in the animal. I think Cattle Trace, a program here in Kansas, is a great example of trying to build that system so that we can better share data and glean efficiencies from having that type of information. 2, competition and economic drivers. So we see new participants entering the beef industry every day. I would use Walmart as an example. So Walmart has now decided to get more involved in what the beef industry is going to look like. They have actually partnered with a seed stock producer, and they're buying cattle with that influence. They're putting it through a packing plant here in Kansas, and they're sending it to the southeast, but with the goal of sharing information back and forth. What do we know about Walmart? Is that when they have entered different animal agriculture spaces, their goal is to create efficiency and drive us to a lower cost of production. And so that's really, I think, what part of this project is about, is learning about the beef industry and figuring out, 1, how can they make us provide them a more consistent product that fits what their customer wants, and 2, how can they make us do it more efficiently? And so I think we're going to have some people enter our business like that have been non-traditional in the past, that are probably going to teach us some things about our business and force us to do things a little bit differently in order to be more competitive, particularly with other protein sources that they can sell. And then 3, our dairy counterparts are going to probably build some supply chains with this beef on dairy trend, and they're going to raise the level of expectations. So what we see happening is they're working on making coordinated supply chains, and the feed yards and the packers and our customers are going to figure out that, hey, this is doable, it can happen, and as they build those, they're going to expect the same thing from us because they see our product as coming from the same place. And so they're going to raise the level of expectation by what some others in our industry are going to expect from us, I think. So 2 of the biggest trends that we see in the AI world, the first one I'm going to talk about real quickly is South America. It is one of the fastest growing beef semen markets for us. So as Dr. Odie talked about a global industry, we spend a lot of time analyzing what that business looks like. One of the things they have an advantage over us on is they have cheap labor. So in terms of AI, the business that I'm in, labor is our biggest issue. If you think about a synchronization protocol, we have to run a cow through a chute 3 times in order to synchronize her before we can create a pregnancy with a straw of semen. And likely she has a calf on her, which means we also get to sort that calf off of her 3 times in order to work her. So it's a very, very labor-intensive technology. The reason that we've never been able to change the amount of AI in the United States, really from about 5 to 7% on cows and 20% on heifers, is because we don't have cheap labor. And so cost always gets in the way of utilizing that technology in a bigger way. Brazil, they don't have that problem. They have a lot of cheap labor. Honestly, it doesn't cost them any more to sort that cow and run her through a chute 3 times. It's no big deal to them, and it doesn't really affect their bottom line. So one of the things that I challenge every reproductive physiologist that I ever get to talk to is that I think it illustrates the need for research on how do we create a less labor-intensive synchronization protocol that we can utilize here in the United States. I tell people, whoever develops that one-shot love potion that puts a cow in heat, and I know when she's going to ovulate, I think it's going to be big bucks for us here in the United States, and it would make us much more competitive with the rest of the world because we will probably never change the labor differences. Brazil has about 232 million head of cattle. That would include steers, cows, heifers, and everything. But their use of AI is a lot higher than ours. So where we're only AIing 5 to 7% of our cows, depending upon the state and where you're located in Brazil, they AI anywhere between 30 to 50% of their cows. So it looks very, very different than what it does here in the United States. The other interesting thing is that they're really improving their genetics. So their cow base looks like that cow up there on the right-hand side. It's a Nelore cow. Those are pretty much the only breed of cows that survive very well in the northern half of Brazil. They would be very similar to our Brahma cattle here in a lot of regards, not only as how they're made, what their production level is in terms of growth, and also the fact that they're not super fertile girls. But they do live in that environment. The problem is Nelore cattle are not necessarily great in terms of efficient beef production. So what they do in Brazil is they take those Nelore cows and we AI them to Angus bulls. And you might say, well, why don't they just turn out Angus bulls? Well, because Angus bulls die in that environment. They literally do not live. And they sure in the heck don't breed any cows because they can't hardly live. And so we actually have to create those pregnancies through artificial insemination because it cannot be done naturally. But that is one of the real drivers, is that there's a premium for a half-blood Angus Nelore calf, and so it incentivizes them to create those cattle through AI. This picture right here would actually be a pen of half Nelore, half Angus steers at a feed yard. So one of the big trends we've seen in Brazil over the last 10 years is it was solely a grass-fed program about 10 to 15 years ago. As they have built infrastructure, gotten better roads, better rail, they've been able to move things around. They have built feed yards that look just like a feed yard would here in southwest Kansas, and they've started to create grain-finished cattle and market those not only to their population, but also to China. They would be the largest exporter of beef to China, and so they are now creating a better product. Does it still compete with ours? No, but is it better than what they have produced forever? Yes, it's a much better product than what they used to produce. They also are utilizing this Nelore cow as a recip. So when we talk about those commercial IVF embryos, they're utilizing her uterus to create an animal that's totally different than anything that her genetics would be able to contribute to an equation. And so that's really, because they've had to figure out how to work around this Nelore cow, they've utilized a lot of different technologies to make a better product. And then the second big trend that we've seen in the beef on dairy, or on the AI industry, has been the beef on dairy movement over the last really 3 years. And I would tell you it's really honestly been over the last 18 months. Lots of people ask, so what has driven us to breed dairy cows to beef bulls? And really there's 4 things. First of all, we have a highly accurate and very comprehensive genomic test available to us in the dairy world. So when you DNA test a Holstein calf today at 2 days of age, you are going to get an EPD that is somewhere between 75 to 90% accurate for most of the traits that we measure in the dairy world. So when that calf is born and we do a DNA test, we can genetically tell you what she is to a very high degree. We're getting much better at it in the beef world. The Angus has the largest database, and we can be about 30 to 45% accurate today in the beef world. So that tells you just how much better we are at it in terms of predicting it on Holstein cows. In 2018, over 500,000 genomic tests were sold in the dairy world. So it's not a technology that just seed stock producers use, but it's a technology that a lot of our large progressive commercial dairy producers use as well. What do they use it to do? They utilize it to sort their female population. So they will test their entire female population, and then they will either put them into quadrants, or they'll take the top third of those females, and they will utilize sex semen to create all the replacements, and then they look at the other 60 to 75% of that cow herd as something simply to lactate and make milk, and then carry a beef pregnancy. And so they're not utilizing 60 to 75% of that herd any longer to create any of their replacements. They're only utilizing the very top end of that herd to create their replacements. So improvements in sex semen also help drive this trend, because as many of you know, sex semen technology has changed a lot in the last 2 to 3 years. It used to be that we couldn't get a lot of pregnancies because it wasn't a very fertile product, and as we have made incremental improvements in the technology, it's now one that we can get very close to conventional semen in terms of creating pregnancies on those females. A tough dairy economy. I don't know if any of you follow what the dairy economy has been like the last 3 years, but it has been really, really tough. And so it used to be that they would look at those calves out of those cows, whether they were Holstein calves, Jersey calves. They were a byproduct of their operation. They just wanted them gone. They didn't care what they got for them. And as their economy got much tougher and they had to look for other ways to pay their bills, all of a sudden they started looking at this beef on dairy calf and saying, you know what, if we can create something that is value added and we can get paid for it, it's another revenue stream to our operation. And so actually, while genomics and sex semen were probably 2 of the first drivers, a tough dairy economy and just making those guys get creative and be non-traditional probably is what really forced the issue for them. And then finally, Dr. Cora, I think, has been great to point this out, but Packer's policy on harvesting straight dairy type animals. So Tyson came out and said, we're not going to kill straight Holstein steers anymore. And so the dairymen are like, wow, what are we going to do when nobody wants the product that we're producing? And so not having a market for what you're producing does make you change your mindset and management strategies just a little faster. This would be just kind of an idea of the trends that we've seen in the dairy industry over the last couple of years in terms of dairy use. So this would be dairy semen usage in the dairy world. This is beef semen usage in the dairy world. I would say the really aggressive, well-managed dairies today are probably breeding 30% of their cows with female sorted sex semen, and they're breeding 70% of their cows with beef semen. We probably have 20% of our producers that are not utilizing any beef strategy in their dairy operation, but I would guess within the next year that almost 100% of the dairies will be utilizing some type of beef strategy within their dairy. So this year it's about a 5 million unit market in the United States of beef semen that will go into dairy cows, and you think, wow, that's a lot of calves, 5 million units. But you got to remember, these are not very fertile animals because of the production that we've bred into them. So it actually takes us somewhere between 3 to 4 units of semen and heat cycles before we actually create a pregnancy. So they're not nearly as fertile as what a beef cow is. So when you look at the size of the market, this is about, we have about 31 million beef cows in the United States. We have about 9.2 million dairy cows. When you look at the percentage of the beef AI matings, we breed about 6% of the beef cows. I was being optimistic, it's probably 5, but 6% of the cows beef AI, because I know you guys are really progressive guys because you're here today. So honestly, I probably could have plugged in 10%, right? Yeah. And then dairy cows, I just went with an estimate of probably around 60% of those dairy cows are seeing some type of beef usage. The reproductive rate is very different. We can get about a 50% conception rate in a beef herd. We can only get about 22% in a dairy herd. So if you were at the coffee shop this morning, you would actually be bragging about a 22% conception rate, believe it or not. We only give beef cows 1 to 2 breeding opportunities. We'll breed them for 1 to 2 heat cycles, and then we probably are going to move that cow on out of our operation. Whereas a dairy, they're eternal optimists. They're already milking that cow. They're not going to get rid of her. She just keeps coming in heat. They just keep putting a straw semen in her. So she probably literally gets 4 to 6 opportunities to get pregnant before they're going to give up. So when you do the math, that means that there's probably somewhere around 1.3 million beef calves a year that are the result of AI that come from a beef cow. And the dairy industry is probably going to create somewhere around 3.5 million of these beef on dairy sired calves a year, given the current situation. The interesting thing is that the first couple of years that this strategy was implemented, we were utilizing what I would call semen that nobody wanted. It was obsolete genetics that we were not able to sell into the beef world. And so these animals were not very good from a genetic perspective. That's really changed over the last year. They realized they have to use some really elite terminal genetics on these animals if they want to capture value for them. So the breeds that would be most popular, Angus Simmental, Charolais Limousine, most of those lineups are going to be somewhere in the top 20% of the breed for a lot of the terminal traits. And ribeye shape, carcass length, and efficiency are probably where they see the greatest concerns in terms of creating cattle that are competitive going forward. So what does all of this mean? I think it means for us as beef producers, and I am actually a beef producer myself, that average domestic beef animals going forward, that means animals that don't have any genetic verification, don't have any management verification, they probably will be discounted because we have really increased the level of opportunity not only for documentation and traceability from these beef on dairy animals, but also the genetic quality and the target that they will hit in terms of end product and the branded beef programs that they will qualify for. And so I think us as beef producers have to realize this is coming. I don't think it's going to be big and ominous, but I think it is going to have to make us a little bit more competitive if we want to be capturing premiums in the marketplace. I think it's going to challenge the beef industry to be better at traceability. Dairy guys have pretty much all gotten used to being traceable because of other things that have happened in their industry. And I think that because they're going to play in the beef market in a bigger way, people are going to look at us and say, why can't you do this? Your counterparts over here can. And so I think if you don't have some type of strategy today to have a traceable product, that's something that you really need to look at doing. I think it's going to lead the beef industry to more coordination of some supply chain development because I think we're just going to create better tools for tracking cattle. And I think that it's also going to help us to start to share that information in a better way. So I think packers and feeders recognize that they're going to have to share information with calf ranches and dairies to get the product that they want. So why would they not share that with the same entities on the beef side of our business? And it's probably going to lead to more specialization. There's going to be a lot of professors in this room that probably disagree with me on that one. I know it's been tried a lot of times before. But I think there will be economic drivers that are passed down to us because of some of the new players in the industry and better information that will have some of us reevaluate our businesses and go, you know what, should I just be producing a terminal product? Or should I just be producing a maternal product that allows me to provide that to somebody who's only going to provide a terminal product? And I think specialization is something that will make our entire industry more efficient, but it's also going to be something that we're going to have a high level of trust in order for that to work. So my crystal ball for the commercial producer, I think that you will use fewer indexes, but I think they will be more specialized to create a product that aligns with your, not only the resources you have available, but the marketing access that you develop and where you target your calves to go. I think there will be technology to make better indexes, and I think there will be new reproductive technologies that may change how you look at your cow herd and what type of product you produce. And I think we'll see increased coordination in a lot of things, traceability. I think one of the really interesting things is as we get at health traits, that is not going to be something short term. We're going to be able to look at health traits back to a newborn calf and how that impacts that animal throughout its entire production chain. I know we've talked about that for a long time, but I think we're actually going to be able to create economic incentives at some point that says how you treated that calf as a newborn, the health that it had, the management it has, could actually be something that you get rewarded for by somebody on the very other end of the chain. From a seed stock prediction, I think there's going to be fewer entities, and I think we will have more small breeders participate with larger breeders in marketing systems. The reason being that the capital requirements to do business are going to be higher. If the beef industry looks anything like what the dairy industry has, the very elite genetics are going to be worth a whole lot more money than what they are today. And we already see that a little bit on the beef side of our business, and so that's going to create increased capital requirements. And then I think also seed stock producers are going to have to utilize more of these reproductive technologies that are going to have some cost associated with them. And then obviously having market access for your customer's product and customer service are going to be very important. Access to genetic information, I think you may have to be aligned with specific entities that are capturing the type of genetic information that allows you to make the progress you want for the system you're tied to. And then I think sex, semen, and embryo technology, I think it's really going to change our business over the next 5 years. We're making lots of progress in the usefulness and how well these technologies perform, as well as what they cost. And then genomics continues to really change things because we're getting better and better. When we get to the accuracy level of the dairy industry with genomic information, things are going to look a lot different. It's going to be really fun. We're going to be able to move really fast. We'll be able to make a lot of genetic progress. Competition's going to be fierce. I think what it means for beef producers is we've got to have a plan. I think operating without a plan anymore in today's environment is a really high-risk situation. I think documenting your genetics and management is going to be more important than it's ever been before and will become an expectation. And I think program participation and downstream relationships are really important. So I had the opportunity to talk to the advanced beef management class yesterday, and it was interesting. About half of those folks are headed home to their home operation. And what I told them is don't go home without a plan, not only for your genetics, but how you plan to market those cattle, because I think it's going to be a more competitive environment, and making sure you're not just developing relationships with your vet and your nutritionist, but downstream with who you're going to be marketing those cattle to, what type of program they're going to go into, how they're going to reward you. I think that is as important. The cool thing is we raise the highest quality, best tasting, safest product in the world, and we can help all these other entities become better at what they do, but they still can't compete with what the U.S. beef producer can do. So with that, that's all I've got.
We'll take some questions. We've got some time, so let's take a few questions. So any questions in the audience that you'd like to ask Lorna? Okay, well, I have one. I noticed that one of the things you didn't talk about is how at the cow-calf level, how we incorporate heterosis into our breeding plan. So And maybe you alluded to that a little bit with terminal crosses, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about heterosis, and I'm thinking particularly on the maternal side.
Yes, so we have better tools today to select more maternal cattle. So for example, the Angus Association this last year came out with a new dollar maternal index that I think is extremely well done, and I think is going to help us make a lot of progress towards putting the right selection pressure on traits that we have in the past in the Angus world: moderate mature size, moderate milk, better feet, more fertility, all of those things. But I think what we will find is that no matter how good of a job we do selecting maternal genetics within a breed, we will never be able to overcome the value of heterosis on the maternal side. The meat animal research data, while it's not brand new, shows us they have more longevity, more stayability, higher reproductive rates, and so I think that we will see more strategic use in a probably composite type situation. And so some of the new entities that we see entering the business, a lot of the privately held genetic information, almost all of those are actually based off of some type of a composite population. They are not straight bred cattle. And so as you see some of these genetic companies enter our space, they see composites as necessary to not only be efficient, but be competitive with other protein sources. So.
Questions? Dr. Day, sitting way up in the back. Yes. Yeah.
So you did a nice job describing the Brazilian industry and how that's growing. Will there put pressure on the export markets that we, as being from the United States, own at this time as they further adopt technology?
You might repeat the question if you.
I don't know if I can. So I think the question is how long before Brazil puts pressure on export markets that we currently serve or compete with us in those export markets? And the answer is the next speaker is going to answer that question. So he knows way better than I do.
She was very well trained. Yes. Dan Latterell.
Yeah. That is a great question. So the question is, so those half-blood Nelore Angus cows that they create in Brazil, once they're weaned, where do they go live? So as you would know, the northern part of Brazil is closer to the equator. The southern part of Brazil is actually very similar to like Kansas, for example, in terms of the marketplace. Most of those would be kind of about halfway down the country. So they are not in the far southern part of the country, but they're not up near the equator either. So that as you would expect, the environment is not quite as humid, not quite as hot. It's still probably hotter than what it would be here in Kansas, but it is a place where those cattle can express their genetic potential, but it's still fairly close to the feed resources that they grow in Brazil. So they have, much like what we've done here in the United States, where a lot of our feeding is close to our grain production. Brazil's industry has been built in a very similar fashion. So they did have to drop a little bit further south due to the environment, heat, tick resistance, all that, but still close to most of the grain production. And then the packing plants have been built where a lot of the feeding entities are. So,
Dave Worrell.
In Brazil, how diversified is the production? I mean, is there a lot of operations, or is it a handful that are controlling all this?
yeah, so actually there's probably people that have traveled to Brazil as much or more than me in this room that I should be letting answer these questions. But Brazil is very unique in that there are no small operations. They are all owned by very big established agricultural families or companies. A lot of companies own these agriculture entities. And so very different from here in the United States, there are no small producers. I mean, we would do business with a lot of producers that control 20 to 50,000 cows, to give you an idea. So it's just on a very different scale than what it is here in the United States.
Other questions? Michael Dykman.
Would you comment on
Yeah, you bet. So kind of what is some of our current results with IVF embryos? So probably one of the biggest projects that we have been involved with recently is putting straight Angus embryos in Jersey cows. So essentially we're trying to get a Jersey cow to lactate, but we don't want to use those genetics to create a beef calf. And the interesting thing is that with conventional semen, so if we breed this Jersey cow with just normal semen, we will get somewhere around 22 to 24% conception rate. We'll be 2 to 3% back of that if we utilize sexed semen. So if we put sexed semen in her, we're probably down in that 18 to 20% range on conception rate. We are showing about a 40 to 42% conception rate with IVF embryos today. So in a dairy cow, and I don't think this is replicatable on a beef cow. You got to remember, a dairy cow is very different because of her production, and she's usually lactating when we're trying to get her pregnant. But we can almost double the conception rate utilizing an IVF embryo that we can with either conventional or sorted semen today. We are seeing a higher abortion rate, early abortion rate, with those IVF embryos, about 5% higher than we do a pregnancy that is conceived with semen. And so there's a lot of research going on in this space right now to kind of figure out what the economic differences are going to be, given kind of the pros and cons. Obviously, an embryo is more expensive than a straw of semen to create that pregnancy, but the pregnancy hopefully has a higher value. The beef side, you would not see that big of a difference, I don't think, in conception rate, because one, the beef cow is much more fertile, and two, her level of production is not nearly as high as a dairy cow is. But I don't have any good data on that, Dr. Dykeman.
Okay, back of the room. Is that Twig? Yes.
The changes in technology that we've seen in the last 10 to 15, 5 years, we're still using standards or ways to classify embryos and semen as we did 20, 30, 40 years ago. Is anybody working on changing those standards so we can better describe the products that we're going to distribute out to the population of the beef industry?
I'm going to defer that. I think Dr. Day could probably better answer that question, but I don't know of any research in that regard. I think a lot of the at least I can say from a select sire's perspective, I think a lot of the benefits that we've seen on the semen side has been in improving the media that we utilize to create our product. But Twig, you're outside my realm of expertise there.
I think you answered it right. Technology is getting better and creative, so they're becoming better. The ways of classifying ways, I'm not aware of any great way to identify.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm sitting here thinking about this, probably a question for you, Lorna, and it may be for our next speaker as well. But if we replace our Holstein calf population, and I'm thinking now of 3 million head, I think 3 million plus is a number you had up there, with beef on dairy, what I'm really interested in is what does that do to our beef supply, and then the I'll call it the quality and yield grade makeup of that beef supply. So have you, I presume you've given this some thought and maybe have some kind of ideas about how this might play out.
Yeah, I'm not a market analyst, so I don't know the answer to that, Dr. Odie. I do know, I mean, just based off the genetics that we're using, I can tell you we are going to create a much more efficient animal than what the typical Holstein steer is. We will create, I think, a higher yielding animal that's got more muscle. And even though we probably don't need to put a lot of selection pressure on marbling, the industry is. The bulls that they're using are high marbling, so we're going to create a lot of product that's going to hit the upper two-thirds of choice and prime. And I think the initial carcass data that Dr. Cora's seen would certainly tell us that. How it affects tonnage, I'm going to leave that for the next speaker.
Okay, we're going to move on, but let's thank Lorna one more time.
Good luck with all that.
Our next speaker is Dr. Derrell Peel. Dr. Peel is a Montana native, has degrees at Montana State, University of Illinois, but for the last 30 years he's been at Oklahoma State University and an extension livestock economist, market economist role. And Dr. Peel probably writes more about beef industry issues in the lay press than almost anyone that I know. And many of you know we've many times used our own ag economists here at Kansas State University, but periodically we try to mix it up and bring in someone from somewhere else. So this year we've got Dr. Peel. And when we were having a conversation about this presentation, obviously we didn't yet have a coronavirus impact on the market, but there's a lot of things that are going on in this entire marketplace. So I think Dr. Peel is really, really well positioned to help us kind of make sense of all of these issues, and particularly the kinds of impacts it might have on those of us that work in the U.S. beef industry. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Derrell Peel to Kansas State University.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me okay? A little more? All right. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. If nothing else, I bring a little point of orange in a sea of purple, and so I'm good with that. We have a great relationship between the two universities, certainly in terms of my discipline and so on. So it's a pleasure to be here and visit with you a little bit. Is it okay?
Can you put it on your shirt?
Get it over here where I can breathe into it, and then it'll really be obnoxious. Is that better? Okay. All right. So yeah, we talked about this presentation, and I'm excited to spend more time on it. I usually have to include some international stuff in my usual broader market outlook stuff, which I'm not doing officially today. So this gives me a chance to dig into it a little bit more. And much like Lorna said, in terms of the genetics and the pace of change, I'm going to show you a quick tour of the world, really, in terms of what's going on with beef markets and to some extent broader meat markets. And you will see that things are changing incredibly rapidly in that space, and we're going to see a lot more things. There's a little preview of what's to come in terms of the picture I use for this particular title slide. That's taken in China, and we are going to talk quite a lot about China in this discussion for a variety of reasons, more so really all the time. So you know, if we put it in terms of headlines, kind of the bottom lines, we're going to touch on these a little bit more. We're going to talk a little bit about Australia and the challenges they've had as one of the major beef exporting countries. Talk just a little bit about Argentina. They were kind of out of the picture for a number of years. They're back right now, depending on the current federal government there. And so, but they have rebounded pretty nicely. The U.S. is growing as a global beef exporter. That was sort of alluded to earlier. And I'm going to talk about that, kind of where our role is and how those things are changing. And then, you know, again, here's the first reference to China. Global beef exports are really being driven increasingly by China. And I'll show you that. It's extremely dramatic what's happened just in the last 2 years in these markets. So on the import side, what are the headlines? China, China, China. And then that leads to some ripple effects in other markets that we'll talk about. You know, a couple of countries like Russia and the U.S. are actually decreasing as a share of global beef imports. So we're seeing some changes there as well. So we're going to go through most of the major exporting and importing countries, talk a little bit about the unique situations of each of them, and then we'll bring it back to the U.S. specifically at the end. As Dr. Odie said, when we talked about this presentation, coronavirus wasn't even on the radar screen. Obviously, it's pretty much covering the radar screen on a day-to-day basis right now. So it's there. It's having a huge impact in the market in several different ways. Obviously, the initial outbreak of it in China caused enormous real impacts in terms of the logistics of a lot of international markets, both China receiving product as well as China as a source of a lot of ingredients that go into various agricultural inputs and so on. Now it's spread to broader markets. We're still trying to figure out exactly where we're going to get to in the U.S. and in other countries in terms of this human health impact. But we're seeing these impacts on logistics and supply chains, which is a very direct effect. And then, of course, indirectly, just a lot of macroeconomic impacts of disruptions in travel and tourism, and later that may translate into or spread down to other markets. So now, having said all that, we don't really know where this thing's going to play out over the next few weeks/months. I don't think it's a matter of days. I think it takes longer than that. We don't know yet how that's going to play out. But most of that, at this point at least, I would feel doesn't really change the story that I'm going to tell in a bigger, longer term sense. So I'm going to go ahead kind of with the story that I had. Again, we may wind up modifying our expectations for 2020, plus or minus some set of weeks or months, but I don't think it changes the bigger picture that's behind the scenes, and that will still be the dominant factor going forward. African swine fever, we do have to talk about that in terms of what has happened primarily in China, at least in terms of the size of the impact, but a number of other countries as well. And that does have implications for all of the meat industries on a global scale. So before we get into some numbers, by the way, if you had any doubt that I'm an economist, you won't in about 30 minutes, because I'm going to show you lots of numbers, lots of graphs. The good news is I won't give a quiz even though we're in a classroom, so there'll be no quiz. But before we get into the numbers, just take a look at the list of the top 10 beef producing and consuming countries in the world. It's worth just looking at the list for a couple of minutes. A couple things kind of stand out to you. Most of them I think you kind of know. But sometimes we forget that most of the countries that produce a lot of beef eat a lot of beef. And that's true of food markets on a global scale. People tend to eat and learn to like what they can grow. Okay, that's been true throughout human history. Not a surprise. There's a couple of exceptions. Japan's a major consumer, at least in the top 10 list, not a major producer. But for the most part, these lists match up. The rank is not always the same. I did want to mention China again as a perspective, because I think a lot of people don't realize that China for many years has been one of the major beef producing and consuming countries in the world. They don't eat a lot of beef per capita, but there's a lot of capita. Okay? I call this the law of Chinese markets. And this applies to any market you want to think about for the rest of the next 3 decades or so. You know what the law of Chinese markets is? Any number times 1.4 billion is a big number. Okay? So China's been a big beef producing and consuming country in total for a long time, but only recently have they been a major factor in terms of global beef trade, and we'll see that. So just now some numbers in graphical form. The U.S. is the biggest producer, Brazil number 2, European Union, China's number 4, India, Argentina, and so on, just for a little perspective in terms of the current forecast for 2020. Now, if we look at the trade list, imports and exports, a lot more diversity in these lists. Exports, we're going to talk about these a bit more. Brazil, India, the U.S., Australia, Argentina, and so on. On the import side, again, the thing that's changed most dramatically in the last 2 years is China is the biggest beef importer now, whereas they were never even a player 5 years ago, 6 years ago. The U.S., Japan, South Korea, and so on. Okay, so we're going to go through these and talk about them. Beef exports, Brazil is the largest beef exporting country in the world, have been for quite a number of years, most of the time. There was a brief period a few years ago where India was actually the largest by a little bit over Brazil. They've dropped back. And of course, for many years prior to that, Australia was the biggest beef exporting country in the world. Something to note, and I'll refer back to it again later if I don't forget, under this forecast, the U.S. may actually export a little more beef than Australia for the first time ever. I'm pretty sure. I didn't go back and try to dig out all the data, but I don't remember any time in the past when we would have been the number 3 beef exporting country. So we have seen some changes there. And then you can see the others, Argentina, New Zealand, Canada, Uruguay, Mexico, and the European Union, and so on. Here's a comparison over the last 5 years. Again, a lot of numbers here, bear with me. So if we add up, now this is USDA's numbers, they call it world production of beef. It's really major world. In other words, it doesn't necessarily include every country in the world, but this probably represents 95+% of the world. And so you can see that exports on a collective basis, total exports, represented about 16% of production 5 years ago. It's up to about 19%. We've seen a growth of about 22% in beef exports. If you look at the top 7 exporting countries, again, Brazil's the biggest one. They've grown 50% in the last 5 years. They've increased their share of those exports from 18 to 22%. India has declined. They're still number 2. They've actually gone backwards by about 6%. They're currently about 15% of global exports. Australia has also declined, and we will talk in more detail about this in just a minute, down to about 13%. The U.S. has grown to be about 13%, increasing total exports about 46% in that 5-year period. Argentina has grown really in percentage terms the most, from less than 2% to over 7% of global exports of beef. New Zealand shares pretty flat. Actually, they've declined just slightly. Their level hasn't changed very much. Canada has increased in percentage terms quite a bit. They're still, they're about 5% of the total. So if we look quickly at these major countries, where does Brazil export beef to? This relates to the earlier question about Brazil and competition. As of 2018, China plus Hong Kong, 41% of their total exports. That's a major change, and it's probably higher than that now. Okay, and certainly will be in 2020. These numbers are changing pretty dramatically just in the last 2 or 3 years. 5 years ago, 6, 7 years ago, China would have been a minor. China and Hong Kong might have been a significant market for them, but the total would have been much lower at that point in time. India, most of that is water buffalo meat. It's classed as bovine meat, so it comes up in this category. Sometimes it's called cara beef. Okay. They're still there as the number 2 market. They've got some internal issues which relates to some of the political situation there. For the most part, they don't or have not competed with the U.S. even as a major exporter because it's a very low quality meat and it's mostly exported to Muslim countries. The one exception to that is they do export quite a bit of this meat to Vietnam, which very probably means a significant amount of it is winding up in China. That happens. We've done that too, by the way. There was a time about 6 or so years ago when Vietnam was actually the number 6 destination for U.S. beef exports. And we know for a fact that much of that was going through Vietnam, but it was ending up in China. Okay, so that's probably what's going on there. Australia, 29%, this was in 2018, 29% to Japan, 21% to the U.S. China was 16% in these numbers then. I'm going to show you some numbers about how that's changed in just a second. You heard a lot in the last few months about the wildfires in Australia. The wildfires are the result of drought, and that's where the big impact is. The wildfires had some direct impact. Most of the wildfires were down in the southeast part of the country, which is significant cattle numbers. Actually, most of their dairy industry is located down here. But it had some direct impacts from the wildfires. But really the big impact on the beef industry is coming from the drought that they've been in for most of the last 6 or 7 years that led to the wildfires. And so that's been the big issue. Their cattle inventory peaked in 2014 at over 29 million head. They're down to 24 million head about now. That's a 30-year low in cattle numbers. Big impacts for them. Beef production goes up and down. When you're liquidating, it actually goes up temporarily. Then you can't sustain it and it goes down. Beef exports are off sharply from last year. And I'll show you the numbers from Australia. These are their own forecasts. Total exports are predicted to be down 20% in 2020 from 2019 on a year-over-year basis. That would include 24% less to the U.S., 34% less to Japan, 30% less to South Korea, but 10% more to China. Again, there's a theme. If you pick up on it here, and so these data would show that in the last 2 years, the share of Australian beef exports going to China has increased from 14% to 30%. Okay, so again, you see the impact here. and why we're going to talk about it. Argentina, as of 2018, about 65% of their exports were going to China, Hong Kong. Again, would have changed very dramatically over the last 5 years or so. Argentina, as I said, has recovered significantly. They were a big player a number of years ago and really got to the point where they were almost not a player at all in global markets. They're kind of back now to some extent. Most of their issues have been political in nature with a government that wants to try to run the entire country off of export taxes. So that's hard on things. I took this picture in 2018 in Shanghai, China. Thought it was kind of interesting. A big ped mall. They have these trolleys that go back and forth. You can jump on. The Argentines were advertising pretty aggressively in Shanghai. I thought that was pretty interesting. New Zealand, 42% in 2018 went to the U.S., 26% to China. I didn't actually calculate the numbers. Those two things might have changed as of 2019, almost flipped. Our imports of beef from China in 2018 dropped 30%. And that's because most of that is being redirected into China. Canada, on the North American continent, we have very integrated market systems anymore, so most of their exports come to the U.S. They're one of our big customers too. We'll get to that in a minute. China is a very minor part of theirs, less than 2%. That's something that we're going to talk about, sort of North American opportunities and the U.S. specifically in China in just a bit. Uruguay. China represents roughly 70% of their exports. Now, if you stop and think about how this has changed dramatically in the last 2 or 3 years, obviously if we're sending that much more additional meat to China, somebody else isn't getting it. Okay, the total has gone up, but there are these ripple effects. Uruguay used to export quite a bit of beef to the Middle East. They basically shut it off, almost entirely being directed towards China. So there are some secondary effects that will play out over the coming years as we see this. Mexico is now a major beef exporter. Most of that comes to the U.S. You can see the growth there in the last decade as a beef exporting country. Again, they don't export much, less than 1% to China, and very little really to anywhere other than the U.S. at this point. I was worried that I wouldn't have enough time. At the pace I'm going to get through this pretty quick, but we probably have opportunities for some discussion here. So let's look at imports. This graph would have changed dramatically in the last 3 or 4 years. For many, many years, the U.S. was the biggest beef importing country in the world. So the scale would have been less than half of what it is here, and it's only been in the last 2 years that China is now not only bigger than the U.S., but bigger by a factor of 2 at least. And in fact, if you recognize, of course, now that Hong Kong is officially part of China, we really increasingly have to put those numbers together. And going forward, that's going to be really important that we look at what goes on in China. The data still comes to us separate. So we get mainland China data separate from Hong Kong. But here in the U.S., we're going to need to add those together because some of what's going to happen as hopefully we see our exports to China grow is that some of that is going to replace what was being considered exports to Hong Kong in the past. Again, it's really a matter of sort of unofficial markets. The gray trade, you can call it whatever you want, will become more official. So it's going to be important for us, particularly in terms of our data, to look at those two together. So you've got China here, Hong Kong is here, so if you add that to that effectively, then they are fully 2.5 times the size of U.S. beef imports as the biggest player. So here's the 5-year comparison on import side. Total imports have grown 27%. Up to 16% of consumption. China is the driver of that, up from 8.7% of global imports to 30% in terms of the 2020 projection, 335% increase in 5 years' time. The U.S. has actually gone down from 20% to 13.5%. Japan continues to grow. Their total imports have grown about 26%. Their share is about the same. They're sort of matching the pace of global imports in terms of the share, but their total imports have grown. South Korea grown more dramatically, 51% increase in the 5-year period. So their share's gone up slightly. Russia has dropped off dramatically, not importing much beef now. They've cut it about in half in terms of the share at least, a 31% decrease. Hong Kong is pretty stable, very slight growth. Their shares dropped a little bit because they're not growing as much as global imports are. Same kind of with the EU, basically. So those top 7 importers in the world represented 61% of total imports. 5 years ago, they represent about 71% now. Okay? So we continue to see, whether you look at it from the export side or the import side, world trade in beef is growing. That's sort of the message here. Okay? Opportunities are out there. It's growing on a global basis. We'll get to here in just a minute sort of where does the U.S. then fit into that? What's our opportunity to participate in that? Japan gets most of their imports from Australia and the U.S., a little bit from a couple of other countries. South Korea, much the same story, a little bit bigger share from the U.S. South Korea has been the fastest growing beef export market for the U.S. for the last 5 or 6 years. Even when we had record high prices in 2014, 2015, South Korea was the only market that continued to import more U.S. beef while everybody else cut back temporarily, at least, due to the high prices. This last year, we saw an overall decrease in U.S. beef exports, about 4%, after growing double digits for 3 years prior to that. But out of that, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but the 4 of our 5 major beef export markets were down last year on a year-over-year basis. South Korea continued to grow. They didn't grow quite as fast, but they were still growing. So that's been a very important market for us and will continue to be. We'll look at that a little more carefully in just a minute. Mexico is also a major beef importer. 82% of that comes from the U.S., a little bit from Canada and Central America. Mexico imports and exports. And I forgot to talk about that when I showed you the list. There were 2 countries that were on both the top 10 exporting countries and the top 10 importing countries. One was Mexico, the other was the U.S. And I've gotten this question for many, many years. We'll come back to it at the end. Think about it. Why do we both import and export beef? Okay, probably the single biggest question that I get, and we'll talk about it as we get here to the end. So if you look at those 7 major countries over the last 6 or 7 years, you can sort of see, what you see obviously again is China jumps up here in terms of growth. The U.S. has been relatively flat, but actually declined a little bit, and so on. If you add them together, it's even more dramatic, I think, in terms of what's driving this thing. The other 6 of the 7 major importing countries, the total hasn't changed very much from 2015 to 2020. It's gone down just slightly. All of the net growth in global beef imports is coming from China. Okay? So that's the story there. Even before we get to things that go beyond this in terms of African swine fever and so on. This was really happening before that, and that's important. So let's talk about China in a little more depth. This is another picture that I took there in 2018. I don't know what you expect China to look like. A lot of people don't expect it to look like this. I did grow up in Montana, and there was a lot of the country that reminded me an awful lot of places that I grew up in. Gorgeous country, actually. So we look at that. Here's what's happened to the beef imports in China. Prior to 2013, China was never a factor at all in global beef trade. They were a big producer and a big consumer, but it was all internal. They ate what they produced. They didn't trade. Didn't need to trade. Since then, we started to see consumption, outpace production in country, so they started to import some, but it's really only been in the last 2 or 3 years that it has really jumped up dramatically. Okay, so massive change in a very short period of time. And so we'll talk about that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the African swine fever impact. This is pork production and consumption in China. They pretty much match each other most of the time. So if you look back here, and it would be basically true going farther back, this level of pork production is 45 to 48% of all the pork in the world. Okay, I didn't put one in here just to show that. China for many years has produced about as much pork in the country as the rest of the world does added together. Okay, they got half of the world's hogs. They had half of the world's hogs. In the last 15 to 18 months, as a result of African swine fever, it depends on who you ask. The official numbers are one thing, estimates are all over the place, but I would say probably more than 50% of their hogs died or were depopulated as a result of African swine fever. That means 25% of all the hogs in the world died in the last year and a half. Okay, that creates tremendous problems for them. Production and consumption both go down here. And you'll notice, and we're going to get into this a bit more, that consumption starts to be a little more ahead of production, which starts to tell you a little bit about what's going on with trade. So they are increasing pork imports where they can. The U.S. did see some of that last year. We expect to see more this year, depending on how the corona thing plays out in the next few months. But clearly the demand is there. We were kind of late to that party in terms of being a source of imports for them because of the trade war and all of that, but we're moving somewhat past that now. And there's just not enough pork in the world to make up for the deficit that exists today in China. Okay, that's the bottom line. And so there's not enough tradable meat of any kind to make up for that deficit. So pork imports are growing. And if you look at the other meats, in fact, this is kind of interesting over the last several years. If you look at beef, we already saw how beef has grown. They've been importing nearly as much beef some of the time as pork, even though they consume about 1/5 the amount of beef to pork. Beef consumption per capita in China is probably in the range of 12, 13 pounds per person. Pork is 60-something pounds. Okay, and so despite that, the growth in total imports of beef and pork and poultry is going up as well. We do expect to see more of that in 2020. All of those are attempts to try to fill in the gap on the left by the African swine fever. So when you add them together, you know, beef, pork, beef, and poultry imports have more than doubled in the last 2 years, or we're expected to this year, based on the current projections. Pretty dramatic change. I tell you, it's almost allergy season. Maybe don't tell them that. I'll get quarantined or something. I don't know. Maybe I need the rest. I'm not sure. That's not a bad thing, maybe. Meat consumption in China. So again, if you look at pork, this is the same thing we saw relative to production a little bit ago. It goes down in 2019. It goes down even more in 2020. Beef consumption and poultry consumption do go up a little bit, but not enough to make up for the deficit. Okay, so the bottom line is there is less meat available for the population in China. Prices obviously are much higher now. It's a major issue for them in terms of both availability of product of any kind as well as the price impacts that it has on them as a result of that. Now, back to beef for a little bit more on China. Where do they get their beef now? We kind of saw that on the export side, but if you look at their imports, Brazil is the largest source, Uruguay, Argentina, so South America, and then Australia and New Zealand. Again, that was 2018. I don't know that these shares will have changed that much to 2019 or 2020. They've all gone up in volume, but probably the shares haven't changed all that much that I'm aware of at this point. But that's where it is. What's not on that list? Anywhere in North America is not on that list. Mexico exports less than 1%, maybe about 1%. The U.S. exported, Mexico represented about 1%, if I remember right, of Chinese beef imports. U.S. exports of beef to China last year was 0.6%. 0.6% of their imports. It represented about 1.1% of our total exports. Canada, we saw earlier, was about a little bit less than 2% of their beef exports are going to China. So North America has not been a player in this thing up to this point, and that really begs the question then of what our opportunities are going forward. We look a little more deeply at U.S. beef trade. This just shows shares. So Japan is still our largest market. It was off a little bit last year. We got a new trade agreement in place that should help stop that erosion. South Korea, as I said, has been growing dramatically, so it's not quite up to the level of Japan, but at the rate of growth they've been at the last few years, they could challenge it in another couple of years. Mexico is number 3, Canada is about 9%, Hong Kong is about 8%, and one of these bars over here is China in 2019, 1.1%. Okay, so that's kind of the way it breaks out now in terms of who we are exporting to. There's a picture of our exports over time. What happened back here? Yeah, December 23rd, 2003, right? First case of BSE. It took us about 8 years to climb out of that hole of that event. And so it took 2018 at the current time was a record level. As I said, we were off a little bit last year, but we have moved back to record level exports and more opportunities in these global markets. So last year, Canada was actually our biggest, this is on the import side, sorry, we switched to imports here. Canada was our biggest source of imports. Australia's number 2, Mexico's number 3, New Zealand number 4, and Brazil number 5, kind of a distant number 5, about 5% of our total imports came from there. So you can see these others are in the range of 13 to 28%, I guess, in terms of beef imports. You've seen some news recently that Brazil may be able to export fresh beef to the U.S. I don't think this is a major threat to the U.S. industry for a couple of reasons. One is what they export now is cooked product, and some of what they would be able to export fresh would just replace cooked products, so some of that would be a displacement. The other thing is, frankly, the market for Brazilian beef in the U.S. is limited. I wouldn't say it can't grow a little bit, but Brazil's going to export more beef to China, and following that, Europe, before there will be a tremendous market in the U.S. So just whatever, if that's on your mind from the headlines you've seen lately, I don't think it's a major change in the situation from a U.S. perspective. There's the imports over time. Total imports have been pretty flat the last 4 years. They were up just a tick last year. Haven't seen a lot of change. We have seen some change in proportions. So New Zealand was off. I didn't talk about that. I mentioned it earlier. Our imports of beef from New Zealand last year were down 30%. Again, that's the China redirection. But the total really hasn't changed very much over this time period. Back to exports for a second so we can talk about opportunities for the U.S. Again, we already talked about the fact that we are not in China now. China is the biggest beef importing country in the world. So what is the potential for us in that and in these other markets? Japan is our biggest market. It's our highest valued market. We certainly want to protect that. And again, we've got some changes in place now with the new trade agreement with them to sort of really get us back to a competitive position that we sort of lost when we walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So hopefully we stop the erosion in that market. in terms of our exports. They were down 11% last year. And we maintain that market. South Korea, as I said, has been our fastest growing market. Those both look to continue at this point. They are high valued markets. In fact, one of the things that changes in there, we start to see some different product mixes. And increasingly, that's going to be a theme from my comments from here on, is that we have to stop talking about beef only in the aggregate. We tend to do that. Beef is, we've been talking about tonnage for the most part of beef. You have to get a lot more specific at some point, whether you're talking about beef demand in the U.S. or beef demand in international markets. Beef is a bunch of different stuff. And it depends on what the products are and so on, what the market potential is. And so, by the way, that's a hint to the answer to the question, why do we both import and export beef, right? Beef isn't one thing. So, so as you look at these markets in Japan and in South Korea, we are seeing, for example, some strength in, traditionally they're markets for things like short ribs, some chuck products, but there's also been some growth in demand for middle meats. A little bit of a steakhouse trend. I was going to call it a fad. I don't think it's a fad necessarily, but a little more interest in sort of a steakhouse kind of a component there in those markets. Okay, and we'll talk about China in a minute in terms of what kinds of products become important. So I did some rough number calculations just to play what if for a little bit. In 2019, so using last year's numbers, again, I said this earlier, the U.S. represented 0.6% of Chinese beef imports, and they represented 1.1% of our total exports. Using the forecast, with the USDA forecast for 2020 for Chinese beef imports, if we could get 2% of that market, so if we could go from 0.6% of that market to 2%, that would be about a 200% increase in exports to China. That would represent about a 3.2% increase in our total exports, and it would make China represent about 3.1% of our total exports. 2% of that rapidly growing Chinese market. If we could get 5% of that market, that would be an 800% increase in exports to China. It would be a 9.5% increase in our total exports, and that's assuming nothing else changes. So if you hold everything else at 2019 levels and you make these changes, that's what would happen. Okay? Now you got to be a little careful with Hong Kong because it might not all stay the same, but assuming it did, then that would be a 9.5% increase in our exports. China would represent almost 9% of our total exports. 10% of the 2020 forecast Chinese market would be an 1,800% increase in exports. It would be a 20% increase in our total exports from the U.S., and they would represent about 17% of total beef exports. Now, that's just what if. Those are just numbers, but I guess there's a couple messages there. One of them is that we don't have to try to dominate the Chinese market. Okay, given where it's at, given the way it's been growing, if we can get 2, 5, 10% of that market, that's a really big deal for the U.S. industry. That would be more growth than we've seen in any other market, especially at the 10% level, than we've had in a long time, okay? Again, it's the law of Chinese markets. It's a big market, and if you can get 1% of a big market, that's a bunch, right? So, that's kind of, I think that's our challenge going forward. Is to get into that. Now, we've been slow. We've had access politically since 2017 to the Chinese market in terms of opening it. And we've been kind of slow to get started on the economic process of trying to develop that market. Markets don't just fall in your lap. You usually got to go earn them. And we've really had a hard time getting started. The trade war slowed us up. So for about 18 months to 2 years, we really couldn't make any progress because we had everything locked up in tariffs and other issues. We're slowly pulling out of some of that at least. And so we can maybe get back to the point where we can think about marketing U.S. beef in China. Now we do face some challenges. Biggest one is that U.S. beef is expensive in China. Okay? The type of beef it is relative to the market that's there and relative to other places where they're currently getting beef, U.S. beef fights a price battle. Okay, so we're going to be more expensive. We have to overcome that. And then we get specific about products. What products? China is not a big steak market. That's not the way they eat. It's not their type of cooking or cuisine. You know, I had a steak in Shanghai, and I've had very little beef anywhere else in the country. Couldn't find the stuff for the most part. And that will grow over time. I'm not just saying that we couldn't ever send some steaks there, but that's not where it's going to start, and that won't be the biggest part of the market. Okay? Barbecue in China looks like this, not big hunks of brisket. Okay? It'll be skewers of this, that, whatever. What quality? Which is relative to price, relative to the competitiveness in that market. Our definition of quality is not necessarily what everybody in the world thinks of as quality, at least in all products. Okay? And so every market, I mentioned this earlier, every export market has different preferences, different notions of quality relative to value, and we have to be aware of that. Okay? And again, we've never had a presence in China, so we have to start and slowly build that over time. I'm reminded a little bit of where we started in Mexico about 30 years ago. When we first started exporting to Mexico, it didn't start off anywhere near the broad-based market that it is today. Back then, it really started with us exporting a little bit of meat to the tourist areas in Mexico City. And we used to jokingly say that we weren't selling beef to Mexicans, we were selling beef to U.S. guys that happened to be on vacation or in business in Mexico City for business. That's where it started. And it did start with a high quality market, and in a place like Shanghai, we'll see some of that, but it'll be a pretty small part of the total to begin with. The broader base market that we have now in Mexico for a lot of other products that are very complementary to us in terms of providing a home for things that we don't have as good a demand for in the U.S., took time. And I think it will take time in China as well. One of the popular forms of restaurant cuisine in China is hot pot. This is a group of OSU students in 2018 enjoying hot pot. That's a special table. That's a pot of hot broth in the middle of the table. It's got a burner underneath. It's red because there's chilies floating all over it. It is very spicy. If you like adventure, it's a great thing to try. It really is good. I can tell you from experience, don't sit downwind from the pot. It's like being pepper sprayed for an hour and a half while you're trying to eat. You know, and how do you cook in that? You can order a wide variety of meats, typically thin sliced. Oftentimes the preference is for relatively fattier products because of the way they're going to cook in that hot pot. Could be beef, could be pork, could be seafood, along with vegetables of various kinds, dumplings, whatever. You put them in the pot, you let them cook for a while, and then you fish something out and eat it. And I don't mean that in a, you know, you don't get your food, you get whatever you catch in the pot, right? It's a lot of fun, it's very tasty, it's a very social meal. You know, that's one kind of popular product. And so, you know, U.S. chuck type products tend to work pretty well in that. A lot of the slices from chuck tend to have a little more fat in them, very popular. That kind of thing. Okay, again, we're not starting off probably talking about a great deal of steaks, middle meats in general, that sort of thing. I have read some stuff from Australia. And again, of course, they're talking about predominantly range-fed beef, so it's a different quality of lean to begin with. But as they've changed from the U.S. to China, so for example, shanks that at one time they would have boned out and sent to us as boneless trimmings to grind into hamburger are now being left as shank cuts and being sent to China. Okay? So the point is we have some work ahead of us as an industry to figure out what the market is, how it's going to work. Obviously, it's a big country. There's lots of issues and logistics involved in developing a presence in that market. So, you know, to kind of summarize, again, a lot of this story's been about China. That's just the way things have evolved the last couple of years. We do have to watch the trade-off there in terms of the data between China and Hong Kong. Japan, again, I think we're back on track to maintain that market a little bit with a little bit better tariff situation now. South Korea has been a very important market, continues to grow. And so those two are there and they're important. We maintain them. The growth potential is in China. We've got the North American markets very integrated, so we see these bilateral flows of meat as well as cattle trade. That's all part of one big market. Now we have a new trade agreement in place which removes some of the uncertainty about that process. And try to list everything else, put Europe in here with a question mark. We do have a little bit more access now to Europe recently, but Europe is probably going to continue to be a fairly challenging market to work in and somewhat limited. Perhaps all the more so now because we've got to figure out what Brexit implies for us. We're going to have to work on multiple fronts there, and they can't even figure out what kind of divorce they're going to have yet. And so that one's going to be a bit of a challenge for us. There's obviously opportunities. I didn't talk at all about Latin American markets. They're important to us. Well, other than Mexico, I guess. But even some of the South American countries, there's some opportunities there. By and large, the Latin markets tend to be lean beef markets. Asian markets like the fattier products, so some of the chuck products work well. Latin markets utilize a lot of round. Most popular dish, one of the most popular dishes in Mexico would be milanesa, which is a breaded, it's kind of like a chicken fried steak without the potatoes and gravy. Very popular, but the raw cut of thin sliced round is also called milanesa. And again, very strong preference towards lean meat, not much marbling relative to US standards, that kind of thing. Final thoughts. Beef, this is probably the most important thing you can take home today, and it wasn't the focal point of this, but I had a grad student that did a project on trying to understand disaggregated beef demand. She graduated last May. She and I did a presentation, actually we presented it twice at NCBA last month, and it was called Beef Demand is Way More Complex Than You Think It Is. We talk about beef demand, economists actually contributed to this problem. We talk about beef demand like it's one thing. It isn't one thing. Beef is a bunch of different products, and every one of those products is a separate market. And many of those products interact with each other. So when you go to the grocery store, the competition for ribeye steaks is only partly pork chops and chicken breast. It's probably flank steaks, or not, well, maybe flank steaks, or strip steaks, or tenderloin. Because if you think about the level of decision making, the first thing somebody looking for a beef product is going to look at is other beef products in many cases. And so now all of a sudden demand gets much more complicated. This research that I was alluding to, we interviewed people from the packers all the way through all forms of final markets, restaurant chains, retail, grocery, export markets, the whole bit. And you can't put a number on it. We don't have any data on it, but my estimation is that the beef industry in total produces over 20,000 different products. It's a heck of a lot more complex than you think it is. And that becomes important in the trade side because those are products, or those are markets for specific products. And again, they can be competitive, so it may be a question of just who has the biggest purchasing power relative to a strong demand here or an even stronger demand in an export market. A lot of them are complementary. Because if we produce I'm going to use an example here, a select top round, and it gets marketed in the grocery store in the US, whoever bought that will buy it at some price, and it will get eaten at some price, but they might have been willing to spend even more to get a choice, strip steak. So if we can export that stuff that has less demand in the US, it not only provides more value in the export market, it actually provides more value to demand in the US. Because the thing about it is, beef is perishable. If we produce it, it is going to get eaten by somebody in the next few weeks or months. Okay? So it's a matter of the markets trying to figure out where value is. Trade plays a very important role in trying to maximize total value in the beef industry. That's how you can find me. Feel free if you would like have any follow-up or anything. I do write a weekly newsletter if anybody's interested in that. And this is something I do on the side. If you want something that might be entertaining, might even be educational occasionally, you can check out that if you're interested. Thank you very much. Yep.
We've got time for a few questions, so if you've got questions for Dr. Peel, please raise your hand and we'll call on you and get your question in front of him. Dr. Dykeman.
Yes, sir.
Could you comment on the impact of tariffs the past couple of years, maybe next 2 years in the future? And also there's been a resurgence of focus on we need to bring back cool. We need to have country of origin labeling. Comment on
You want to
those
repeat
things?
the question?
Okay, 2 questions there. One was on sort of the previous and ongoing impacts of tariffs and the trade wars we've been involved in. The other one related to country of origin labeling discussion that continues. Both of those could be workshops in and of themselves. How do I want to say this? Tariffs, obviously, based on political objectives. We accomplished some things with everything we've done with the trade wars, broadly speaking, and I'm not getting specific here. They vary a little bit in detail. At the end of the day, we're talking about basically being in a little bit better shape compared to the trade war because we largely are back where we were, or trying to get back where we were. That would be my take of it. Okay? USMCA is NAFTA and that much more. The trade agreement with Japan, again, restores the tariff situation that we had or would have had we stayed in TPP. China, that's a little bit different deal because that's kind of a new ball game for us. I don't want to comment on politics. Everybody's got their view of that. From an economic standpoint, I think it's pretty clear when I said trade is essential to finding value in the industry that I like trade. So I don't like things that interrupt trade. I think it was costly. Was it worth it in the short run for long-term gains? That's a decision or a judgment that somebody will make. Country of origin labeling. Here's the best thing I can say about that. Sounds simple, it sounds obvious, until you remember that I just told you the beef industry produces over 20,000 products. And that's just a guess. It might be twice that much. I don't know. I don't think country of origin labeling fundamentally changes anything in terms of values in the industry. Okay? And it is costly to do, of dubious value in total. So I don't think it really changes things if we don't do it. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay, other questions for Dr. Peel?
I may not get to eat lunch now.
Maybe up about 80% of the way. Sir, go ahead.
So we've seen a country like Russia has made a push to become less reliant on importing beef and developing their own beef market. Do you anticipate a country like China, or are we seeing China try to increase their own domestic beef market?
Good question. So his question was, Russia is an example of a country that has made a push to try to be more self-reliant in terms of beef supplies, beef production. Would China do that? Longer term, you'd have to expect that they might do that, given the demand that has grown there. The stuff I read and what little I know in terms of experience in China would suggest that it's kind of a matter of priority, I think, within the country. Of course, they do have more total control over things from a government standpoint, so if they want it to happen, they can probably make it happen. I think their focus, obviously right now, it's on the pork side, trying to recover from African swine fever. Longer term than that, and was really kind of already in place before that, I think dairy and poultry probably are higher priorities. Beef has been left to be a lower priority in terms of trying to take that industry from a very small scale, low tech kind of an industry to something higher tech. Now, with the growth in imports we see, that may be part of the emphasis for them to put more effort into that. The other side of it is, from what little I understand, and it is pretty limited, I'll admit that up front, in terms of the potential to increase beef production in China, I suspect it's considerable. It is a very small scale, low tech based industry. I traveled between 3,000 and 4,000 miles by train around China in 2018, and in that whole trip, I think I saw a dozen cows out in pasture. Now, that doesn't mean the cows weren't there. They're in these little farmsteads, they're in stalls, they're grazing roadsides, crop aftermath. You don't see big herds of cattle in the center part of the country, at least. Now, if you get into the more arid areas, there is some big grasslands. My understanding is that there are some bigger cattle operations in those areas. I haven't yet gotten to go see them. It's, I have one picture that probably represents my travels around China. I thought about sticking it in this morning. I managed to get one picture from the bullet train at 180 miles an hour, and it shows one horse, one cow, and one water buffalo in different parts of a field. They all showed up in the same picture. It's kind of what you see. So I do think longer term we might see that. I don't think it happens immediately in terms of China making a big push to increase beef production. But, again, when they get to it and they want to make it happen, they certainly can. I did have a conversation with an animal scientist in Beijing at their ag university, and he did talk about the fact that they're beginning to sort of dabble a little bit with genetics. They use primarily, yellow cattle, broadly speaking, right? So native cattle. They're relatively small framed, relatively light muscled cattle, and they are beginning to dabble a little bit in bringing in some European genetics, crossbreeding, that kind of thing. And so again, they probably have considerable potential to increase beef production, but they're just not really making a big push to do that. And it would require a substantial revision of the industry or restructuring of the industry from an extremely diverse. Average herd size in China is probably 4 head. So, a typical little farmer would have 2 cows, maybe 3 cows, and 2 or 3 other animals. So it's very, very small scale, very low tech at this point in time.
Okay, I have one question, if I could. If trying to understand this impact of African swine fever, if we've lost half the pigs in China, I think that's paraphrasing what you said.
Yep.
Why is the 2020 pork supply in China on your figure look to me like it's only about 15% down?
Yeah, the impact on pork production doesn't match hog numbers. Part of that is the fact that a bunch of those hogs that died get eaten, right? So when you're liquidating, you get some meat, and so some of that winds up building buffer supplies, cold storage supplies, and so on. The other thing is, there's beginning to be some indication that they are starting to be able to rebuild a little bit, and so total production may not be as much down as the initial reduction in hog numbers would suggest, potentially.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank Dr. Peel one more time. Before we break for lunch, I have a few announcements. I'd like to call your attention to the afternoon sessions that we have planned. So here in Weber 123, there will be a repeating session with factors influencing sale price of calves. This is a bunch of the superior livestock data that we'll be sharing with you. And that'll be at 1 o'clock, and then a repeating session at 2 o'clock. In Weber 111, we'll have an update on insemination timing with sex semen, split time AI, and embryonic loss with Dr. Sandy Johnson, Dr. Dave Grieger. And then in Weber 146, we have current changes in the Mexican meat industry and the impact of Mexico's new beef quality grading system. and that's a repeated session at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in room 146. 146 is right across the hall over here. And then we also have a session going on at 1:15 up at our purebred beef unit in our what we call our multi-purpose room, calving schools, tools, timeframes, intervention tips, Dr. A.J. Tarpoff, and we have a second session up there at the same time in our purebred beef processing barn entitled Where Ruminant Digestion Begins, with some of our College of Veterinary Medicine colleagues in that session. And then we also have a session at the stocker unit at 1:15, forage sampling and analysis with Dr. Justin Wagner, and then at 2:15 a stocker unit tour. So please pick and choose from those sessions. And then at 4 o'clock we have our legacy sale starting up at the Stanley Stout Center. So we invite you to participate and attend the rest of these sessions as you choose. Instructions for lunch through these doors, up the steps and down the hall, and lunch will be served, and my suspicion is it's probably just about perfect timing here to get you in the lunch line. So anyway, lunch is next, and enjoy the sessions this afternoon. Thank you.